we'll just dive in.
Go for
Chuck,
it.
welcome.
Hey. Thanks, man. It's nice to be here.
Yeah.
Nice to see everybody.
You're about, it's today's Friday. You've had a long week. You're about to fly out.
I have had a long week.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How are you feeling? Any big takeaways from the last few days that have surprised you, or anything jump out?
Surprise is, these things like numb me. First of all, I think people think because I get up and talk in front of crowds that I'm an extrovert, and I'm like a massive introvert.
Right.
And it's a lot of people and a lot of talking, like a lot of small talk. And I like talking to friends, like it's really easy, but like I meet so many people and they're really excited and they're really happy, and I want to pay attention to them and I want to hear their story and I want to understand. But I struggle to process it all. I struggle to keep it all in my brain. I'm terrible with names, and so I feel guilty about not remembering everybody's name and everybody's story.
Yeah, it's hard.
So by the time we get to an end of a week like this, I need like quiet time alone in the garden to just like recoup. But that being said, I remember years ago when this was me. And I remember driving 7 hours to do a talk in Bismarck and 2 people showed up. I remember when we had 10 readers a month on the website. So the idea that we would call a gathering and 600 people would show up, and not just show up to be like, okay, tell us what you want to say, but show up to create this thing with us, to tell their stories, to be excited, to share, and bring this like wealth of stuff people are doing to the table. It's overwhelming for me in like a surreal kind of way. I have to, you metaphorically, people, I pinch myself to see if I can't believe what this is.
Yeah, it's pretty easy, at least for me sometimes, to think of conferences too as a sort of a ego-driven, people just communicating to each other the same ideas over and over again. But I had a couple moments over the last few days. One was on a tour I gave, but the importance of, to your point, you've built this movement, and I met, I think it was Mansfield, Texas, or south of Dallas.
Yeah.
The mayor, city manager were there. They had brought the council up, the engineers.
Yeah.
And this city manager was talking to me and just saying like, yeah, God, I have a moment in time, we're growing like crazy and we're making big changes, and I have to show them, they have to see this.
To see it. And
then we can come back and I can build the political will to get it done.
For me, I do so much travel and I meet with so many people. And then, we still run our media site. So we're publishing 2-3 articles a day and 3 different podcast streams and all kinds of video. This stuff crosses my desk all the time. So I'm hearing these stories continuously. I mean, I feel like the gathering is like this stage to let people tell their story, but we're literally picking like 2% of the stories that we could tell. I'm like, there's so much more here, everybody. But watching people be able to talk about what they do, share their experience, and watching everybody else react to it, just having people's mind blown. Barka Patel at the end, I mean, I had high expectations for what her presentation would be. I did not have that high of expectations. And I mean, the idea that here is this very intelligent, very feisty young woman put into this role with given like no resources, but a little bit of authority, and how she took that and said, I'm gonna make this place a better place, like a little bit by a little bit by a little bit. I know there were a lot of people in the audience watching that. And I had heard that story, I mean, I knew that story. She presented it brilliantly. I watched people in the audience who had not heard that story just have their whole world changed. Like everything's different now. And that's what you want to do when you bring people together like this.
Yeah, because it is so easy. I used to see this in my last job working in nonprofits, where it's so easy for folks to come to these things and say, well, we're not them. They have resources we don't have.
Oh man, continuously.
And so kind of really pushing this idea of I started with nothing and incrementally got there. You don't confuse my starting point or my point in time with your point in time. Like, you will get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is where, I mean, I'll say, because we're sitting here in your office, this is where I feel like in the very early days of Strong Towns, as I'm trying to answer the question, what do we do? When you and I first met, I mean, I had a narrative, I had an explanation that had taken me a decade or more to put together to explain why our city struggled financially and why the suburban development pattern and the denuding of cities to accommodate automobiles and, you know, the suburban style of development was creating all this financial stress. And the question that I was getting on the road in those very early days was, okay, like this is really compelling, but what do we do? And I'm like, I have no idea. Like, just stop doing dumb projects. But then, like, well, what positive do we do? Because we're humans, we have to do something. And I'm like, I don't know. You and I walking around Pittsburgh, and you and I talking about your work and the way you were approaching things, learning from Mike Lydon, learning from you know, other people who were doing like the incremental stuff. I remember having the same reaction, and I love Cade Benfield. I pick on him a little bit because I ran this by him once, and he's like, don't tell me you're out promoting pallet benches. Like those, we got to do more than that.
Benches,
and
yeah.
I remember thinking, you know, I'm an engineer. There's something like, not beneath me, but I've got to have more than just going out and doing incremental stuff. And the more I looked at it, the more I started to understand, the more I saw the work that you were doing, the work that Street Plans Collaboratives were doing, you know, other people starting to copy you and adopt those approaches, the more I recognized that, like, this is the starting point. I mean, this is where the conversation needs to begin.
Yeah.
And it's not just a unique solution to today. It actually is how people built cities, like going
Absolutely.
back through time. Yes, there were people who built the Roman Colosseum, but they didn't do that until lots of people had done lots of incremental things.
You know, not to go off on go down a rabbit hole.
I
here,
love rabbit holes.
But, you know, I don't know, you probably have heard, I'm sure you've heard the story of the Better Bus Coalition here in Cincinnati. You said benches. These guys, a couple guys just built benches because there were no benches at bus stops.
Yeah.
And those guys now work at Metro, and we just passed a tax levy to increase our bus rapid transit
to fix
system.
it, right.
And, you know, so incremental is the right word, but it's a little deceiving because it isn't small. It's big.
Well,
not
and,
small.
and it's not a static moment in time.
Right.
It steps on a much bigger ladder that people don't always appreciate. They
Right.
think just because you're doing the pallet benches that you're doomed for pallet benches for the rest of your life.
That somehow we desire pallet benches instead of, you know,
Right.
the idea that, like, we desire a really nice transit system. If I have to have my entry point be that, it's never going to work. But if my entry point is here, I can do that, and then I can do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And, you know, the pallet
What
benches.
else can I do?
Right.
Yeah.
The pallet benches is a good example because ultimately what you're doing, almost from like a marketing standpoint, is you're drawing attention to a deficiency, you're demonstrating a need, and then you're using that to catalyze like the next level of investment. And really that's what the greatest of these projects do. We have this 4-step process at Strong Towns. We talk about humbly observing where people struggle. And that slide, that 4-step process, so many people now go around and talk about it in a way that I never anticipated. When I first wrote that, I was thinking of city staff members. I used to do that work. And how do you figure out what project you're going to do? Well, you have some community meetings. You like, oh, there's a grant to do this. Well, we maybe should do that then. And you really have your work being selling the big project. Mm-hmm. It is just 180 degrees to go out and say, okay, I'm not going to sell the big project. I'm not going to take my brilliance, whatever I think that is, and like try to convince everyone else that they should follow my vision. I'm going to go out and try to figure out like what's not working. And if I can be humble about that and then say, all right, what's the next little thing I can do to make that better? I can gain information by watching how people react to that and learn, like, have I got it right or not? If you are read Darwin or you read, to me, all of this is based on this sound foundation of like, this is how you actually figure stuff out.
Mm-hmm. So you guys were chatting earlier, and I've heard about this famous next gen moment in South Florida at somebody's house where Joe and you and I think Mike Lydon and others hung out and brainstormed ideas that have grown into some pretty substantial things. You guys want to chat about that for a minute?
Well,
what's the memory of that like?
For me, it started in New Orleans. I got invited to what they call the Next Gen Summit. The idea there was a group.
It was part of CNU.
The next generation of CNU is what we labeled ourselves, and it was just a bunch of like younger. I was the oldest one of the group. It was a younger group of people who were early in their profession, trying to figure out like what to
kind
do.
of labeled as the whiny Gen X millennial group.
Yeah.
That
And
wasn't a sellable name though. We had to rebrand.
Right.
And as Gen Xers, we were all slackers and like, just wanted to. But the way
Talking
that
about the internet and
exactly
all these weird things.
Yeah. The way it was pitched to me is you can come and hang out with this group of people who are all very interesting and doing interesting work. The price of admission was you had to do a short presentation, a Pechakucha 6-minute, 20-second, and they would draw names out of a hat, and if your name got drawn, it was your turn to go up and do yours. And so you sat there for a day, and this is the format we used in South Beach too. You spent a whole day listening to 20-some different people giving a presentation, and the things had themes, but it was kind of like, what's the next thing? What's the thing we're
things
working
that
on?
people were wrestling with. Yeah.
Questions people were wrestling with. And so you did that all day. And I mean, these were really smart people dealing with really like meaty things. And then we go out to dinner, have a nice, dinner, walk around the city and chat about things. And then the next day we'd spend the whole day kind of working on it. All right, you've got something, like, let's work on your thing. Let's work on my thing. And, I laugh because the very first one, we were staying in a house that Andre Stwani owned in New Orleans, and there were no beds. I mean, the beds were all taken, the couches were all taken. I wound up sleeping, I did get a sheet somehow, but I wound up sleeping on the hardwood floor in the kitchen with Mike Lydon. Mike Lydon and I slept on the floor, hardwood floor in the kitchen. I used my backpack as a pillow. Did you share your sheet with him? I don't think I shared my sheet. That would be very funny though.
I hear he still holds a grudge against
He
you.
probably does, because I think
he used found items to build his bed.
I feel like he had a sheet too. I feel like we both were at equally uncomfortable, dispositions. But out of that, and then out of South Beach, and then kind of kicking off at really West Palm Beach, where we had kind of our third, all right, we're all gonna get together at the CNU there, came all of these like amazing initiatives. Strung Towns being one that was kind of in formation, but really got kicked off there. I know Mike working on the tactical urbanism. He actually wrote the first tactical urbanism handbook on the plane home from New Orleans. Your stuff that you were working on, kind of getting center stage there. I know there were a bunch of other ones, and it's one of those, I was gonna say like Beatles stories, but probably not. We're just like a bunch of people who were would otherwise have been ships in the night. Ran into each other, made some magic, and then there's this explosion of creativity out of it. And I can tell you, for my part, that accelerated my understanding just at the pace that I was putting things together, it accelerated it by 5 years. I mean, it really energized.
Yeah.
Just filled in gaps of knowledge that I didn't have.
Well, it answers a lot of questions. It forces you to think on them in a critical way, but you're never going to see a more difficult crowd to talk about those ideas too. Those guys are going to strip you down 3 ways to none.
I think
stress it
CNU at its best
Yes, I agree.
is an internally critical organization.
I agree. This
Where we
came
make
up.
each other stronger, right?
We were at the lunch for mentees in the emerging new urbanists, and I was at a table where someone brought that up. They said the best thing about CNU when it's at its best is it's really we're productively critiquing one another, but being pretty savage about it at times, but in a productive way, and sort of making each other better. That's the kind of the best moments that are happening at CNU.
Yes.
Yeah, and to kind of connect that lunch to what we're talking about with the next gen, like next gen has now just become the gen.
It has. I mean, you look at the board now.
Yeah.
Russ is on the board.
Right.
Mike Leiden's on the board. Matt Lambert's on the board. They were all in the New Orleans one with me.
Yeah.
Right. My board has Andrew Burleson, who is in South Beach, Ian Rasmussen, who I met in New Orleans and was also in South Beach, and that's the foundation of our
now we
organization.
complain about
We're the Gen, yeah.
Well,
Gen
but
Zs.
what I was going to say is actually, I can't speak for you all or others, but I'm blown away and impressed by what ENU, Emerging New Urbanists, are doing. They're super inclusive, they're super curious, they're organized as all be. Like they already formed their own 501c3.
Today's event was pretty good.
They have a booth. Like we would have, next gen would have never made a booth. We would have kicked a booth over maybe on our way out the door.
I don't have anything to compare it to because I wasn't involved in CNU back when you all were, but it is very impressive. And it's really nice to, I really like seeing that they want to learn from people who've done the work. So they're really intentional about matching the young people up with the established people. And as you know, we talk about a lot in our firm, and that's a big part of our DNA is really is supporting those younger folks, but also learning from them too. They have a lot to give.
So, you know, we've been doing these for a long time, these congresses. You've now formed a movement that is robust enough to have its own gathering. What are some of the things that you've instilled and your team has instilled in the gathering that are kind of a result of those lessons learned along the way?
It's a really good question, and there's some, I mean, obviously our thing is very different than CNU. It has a different feel and a different flavor, and there's been a part of me that's wanted them to mesh more. We've tried to do more strong town stuff at CNU and get CNU more involved in ours, and that meshing has been hard because I'll tell you the number one feedback that I get from people who are CNU people who also attended the strong town stuff is, oh my gosh, your group is so young. Everybody there is so young. You have such a young group. And I don't know as it's young as it is diverse, like professionally, right? I think, I don't know as we do a better job with like racial diversity or ethnic diversity than CNU does, perhaps a little bit, but we certainly have this like generational diversity. And I think within that, what you see is a lot of people who come to strong towns with what's for CNU would be very like non-traditional weird backgrounds.
Yeah, right. And I think that's the way you're able to broaden who is part of it because you're you're cross domains.
Cross domains.
Yeah. Anyway, I was hanging out with a group from Spokane, Washington last night, Reimagine Spokane, which is the Strong Towns affiliate. And these are misfits and creatives and people from all sorts of walks of life.
We call it the island of misfit toys.
Yeah.
That's like really like people who just, I really want to make change, but I'm not an engineer. I'm not a planner. I don't work at City Hall. We have some of those people too, right?
Their response is almost like, that's the point.
That's the point.
Yeah. It's not somebody else's job to make the change.
We had a really,
Absolutely.
you'll like the story. We were just standing around the office, I think on Monday, and Andre on our team, I think, brought in these 4 young people, and they went to the kitchen table and were chatting with a couple of us, and we were 15 minutes into the conversation before I realized that they weren't planners. I mean, I assumed they were here and they were young professional planners, and but they were fluently talking our language and asking good questions. And then I was like, "So where do you guys work?" And they were like, "Oh, I'm an accountant in Miami, and I'm I'm a lawyer." They were just normal people who are, and they one of them had gone to Charlotte last year and said it was the best experience they'd ever had at a conference.
To the national gathering.
To the national gathering, and then brought these 3 friends this time.
That means a lot.
And it was great, yeah.
I feel like there's 2 takeaways. The first one is that a lot of what we do as professionals is not hard for people to understand. You might not have had 7 quarters of calculus. You might not have taken statics and thermodynamics. Okay, there might be some things about technically designing a pipe culvert that I know that you don't, but we all grasp the base elements of what it takes to build a city.
We all share a place in common.
Well, I think that's the second insight, is that a lot of times professionals are blind to the human element that you really only get by experiencing a place. And I think we often, I'll speak as an engineer and as a planner, we can reduce things down to lines on paper, pipe inverts, street section widths, zoning classifications, standards, and we lose a lot of what makes a place a place. There's an infinite number of places that really brilliant planners have built where there's no people in there, and there's no life, and there's no activation. And you look at that and you're like, it's not because they lack the resources, it's not because they were not smart, it's not because they didn't try, it's because they didn't start with this other set of knowledge about the way humans work.
Right.
So I'm curious about the process of growing a movement. We talk about that a lot in our work. Did you, my question is about intentionality. Did you say, okay, for this to be successful, we have to reach across domains, we have to sculpt our narrative, our language, our approach to reaching these people. Let's translate the jargon into reaching those people. Or was it the reverse of that, that as you really focused on the message and the case that you were laying out, that just happened to be approachable to cross-domain thinking?
I think that it was in 2 different phases. And in one phase it was one way, and in the other phase it was the other. So at the very beginning, Strung Towns was just me writing a blog. Right. And I had worked in enough places, and I'm a small town guy. I grew up on a farm. My dad worked at the mill and got hurt and then went back to school and became a teacher. But he was like a really good teacher because he was the kind of kid who got D's in school, And when I started writing, my target audience was my dad. My dad's gonna think all this stuff is BS. When I go tell him, we should reduce parking, he would be like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I knew I had to explain it in a way where he could grasp it. And not just grasp it, but okay, that makes some sense. You got me there. I'll ponder that, I'll consider that. And I found that by writing to my dad, or writing with my dad in mind, that a lot of people found it approachable. I don't speak in jargon. I don't adopt a lot. Because I'm small town, I'm not immersed in the urbanist progressive language about things. And so I found I had to explain density in a different way. I couldn't use the word sprawl, because everybody I knew lived in sprawl, and if I said sprawl sucks, they'd be like, well, I like my house,
Yeah. Right.
It was in 2014 when I went through a couple board phases. So when you start a 501c3, I was on the board, and then I had to get off the board because I became an employee, and then we had a Minnesota board, and we had to become a national board because we had all these members all over the place. When we got the current board we have now, which joined in 2014, that was when we started talking about strategy. And our strategy, I'll sum it up like this, because we were actually sitting in a meeting going, someone, I think it was Andrew Burleson, said, so let me get this straight. We're trying to change the entire development pattern of North America, the multi-trillion-dollar industry. What's our budget again? It's like $50,000, And so we recognized early on that the only way we could accomplish our mission was to make it, we called it a mind virus at the time. We had to change the way people talked about growth and development, talked about public investment, talked about cities. We had to actually change the language. And so that became the movement building technique. We said we can't outspend the development industry. I can't go to every conference everywhere and talk to everybody. So we have to actually have people share our message for us in their place.
Did you have that vision in mind, though, to Joe's question at the beginning? We want to change the development pattern of North America?
Yeah, that was the plan. That was
Really?
the mission. Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, the idea was...
And you didn't know where it was going to take you, but that was kind of the North Star of the whole thing.
In the early days of writing the blog, I was really trying to explain to myself and to others why this wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And do it in a way that people could understand. And then it got to the point where like that became an urgent calling, like this isn't working, and I'm running around like Chicken Little saying the sky is falling, and no one's listening to me. The board helped me turn that into something that could get traction.
Great.
And the idea of what could get traction, so I could stop being Chicken Little and start being helpful, was that we were going to grow a movement. And I had to be able to give you language that you could share with people in your community, and give you language that you could share with people in your community, because that's the way that this would grow kind of exponentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you guys had a good article recently about...
We've had a couple.
Well, yeah, planners as, I'm butchering the title, but planners as salesmen.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, it was a good article about how to sell an idea.
Okay.
And I was teaching a class at the time, and I shared it with them.
I gotta tell you, we have more writers now. We have so many people who write for us, and I actually can't keep up with all the content myself. That's great. People will say, I can't read everything you guys publish, and I'm like, that's okay, I can't either.
I can't either.
But I don't remember that one, but you found it useful.
I did. I thought it was great because I don't think planners think of themselves as selling an idea when they present it in public. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of what you're saying is instead of just presenting why you want to approve a zoning change, let's say, in a meeting, and it might be controversial, that you're actually think of yourself as someone who works in marketing or sales and is getting up there, and you have to sell the idea, which is a very different technique of presenting something than just kind of presenting a PowerPoint of the motion that's trying to be passed.
I think big city, I'll say this as a generality, I think working in a big city as a planner has a lot of disadvantages that I was not encumbered with doing the work that I was doing in smaller towns. If you were, like, I was in Austin for a planning commission meeting they did, and like the staff gets up and they make their presentation, and it's a PowerPoint on the board, and then they sit down, and then it's the commission and the public, and it's they might ask a technical question of the staff, but the staff can almost be like aloof from the whole thing. Mm-hmm. In a small town, they're like, okay, Chuck, like, go. And I gotta stand up in front of like angry people who are like anti-government. Mm-hmm. I remember once there was this guy, we were trying to change the zoning code and do some like a bigger rewrite of it. And he became convinced that I was with Hans Blix and the weapons inspectors. So this was back in the Gulf War. There actually is a band that started in Brainerd. From a planner and some guys started a band because I told him this story. And he's like, I want to have that as a band name.
Great.
Hans Blix and the Weapons Inspectors.
Now I have to actually listen to him.
No, dude.
Back up my joke.
They do folk music. It's kind of fun. But he got up and he had a revival at the school. And he had probably 80 people in the school. And he was like, this planner, and part of it was we were required by the state to adopt adult use ordinances. And of course, they describe what is profane and what isn't and all this. And he's putting just like definitions up on the thing. And like, this planner's gonna come and look in your window. And if he doesn't like what you're doing in your bed, he's gonna take your kids away from you. And it was that kind of like crazy stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I stood up in the middle of this meeting with like 80 people. And there were people yelling like, if he comes to my house, I got a shotgun, you know? And like, I gotta stand up there and answer their questions. And I can't answer them aloof. I have to answer them like I would talk to my dad, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, I'm with you. I don't want the government to have overreach in your community. But we also, don't want people to open up a porn shop next to a church or school. So let's talk about how we do that.
Solve this together.
Right. And I think it kind of makes, I feel bad for planners who don't get that opportunity. Mm-hmm. Because they're often relegated to just zoning paperwork,
Yeah.
when I think there's a lot more dynamism. This is why I feel like if I'm a planner in a city, I want to do your stuff. Like I want to do bottom-up tactical stuff because it's my opportunity to actually have my brilliance do something.
Yeah.
As
We
opposed
oftentimes
to
get
shuffling
constrained.
paper.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we'll be in a meeting with some city staff, and they'll be the planning director or whatever, and then there's like the quiet mid-level, lower-level person, and they'll slide the note across the table, and it says "Save me."
Yes. And like I can see like that's the person we need.
Yeah,
And I think we actually get hired sometimes because we just have fun.
yeah. It's like
We're like, oh my gosh, we could have some fun.
I could buy friends.
Right.
We did this community action lab thing. We did a year-long engagement in 4 different places. And the earliest thing we're trying to do is identify the second-tier people who have that. And it's not, it is, they see what's wrong, but they don't have enough power to deal with it. And in our like strategy, those are the people that if you infect them with the virus, if you give them the words and the language and the questions to ask and the way to talk about it, they will infect the whole organization, right?
That's smart.
Well, if you ask, like, what's the return on, we're doing this new suburban development, we're spending $3 million on infrastructure, how much tax base are we gonna get, and how much revenue is that gonna be, and how will we pay to maintain this? Those are very simple, basic questions, and when you ask them and answer them, it changes the entire scope of that project.
Now, what are we getting? What are we losing?
Right,
Yeah.
and the fact that like no one's empowered to ask that, when you can give them that language, it just becomes, and then you give them a worksheet to pull out, like here's how we can actually figure this out. Because the first thing they'll get is like, well, we don't know how to do that. Well, here's a worksheet how to do it, and here's a video on how to do it. Let's figure this out. And then you get the council members asking for it, like we want this information. So there's a way to infect the system in a sense. And this is maybe getting back to your observation of us being the gen and the next group being the exciting group. I read this one where that like everybody has frustration with the generation ahead of them and bewilderment at the generation after them, right? And like that's a normal thing. My bewilderment with the generation behind us is also, I think, their strength in that they all think that they're kind of important and have a calling in life, and they're not afraid to speak up and do things. And I think for what we're doing, that is like a double positive. Because if you can help them ask good questions and stuff, they really are powerful.
They are.
Well, and they want, this sounds going to sound like a criticism, same way I think it's a strength, especially for our work. They want immediate gratification. And
yes,
and they want problem solved right away, and that's typically a criticism of them. But I think with our industry, it creates a level of ambition and excitement and get it done, build the pallet bench kind of an attitude that fits really well into this.
How I know I'm getting old is I'm no longer frustrated with the generation above me. So I've become the top of your diagram.
See, I feel directly in the middle right now. I feel both a lot.
Yeah.
I see their days as numbered.
Yeah.
And it makes, the old Darwin, the last chapter of Origin of Species, he says something along the lines of progress happens one funeral at a time. And, I'm watching my old bosses be, a decade now into retirement, the people that I was frustrated with. And it makes me realize like, this is the time I gotta do something.
So,
right?
This might be a good transition. So we're sort of speaking about things that I think of politics with, and I listened to your podcast a couple podcasts ago, I think at this point, where you talked about politics and
where I laid out the Strong Towns vision for the election year.
The doctrine.
Yes.
And
that was as close to clickbait as we get.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
It's an election year.
But you have built this movement of millions, right? Of people working within a political framework or within, a democratic framework of fixing their own communities. And there are conservative angles to what you do, and there are progressive angles to what you do. and it's all a circle, right? And the farther right you go, you get closer to the left, farther
Sure,
left. But,
sure.
But you have walked a fine line, I feel like, of not taking political stances, avoiding aligning your work with one party over another.
Yeah.
Do you, and you talked about this a little bit in your podcast, but have you felt a need to gravitate to one side or another, or is that a pretty easy decision for you to just say, to stay, I don't want to say in the middle, but...
It's not in the middle. That's the thing. It took me a long time to understand this, because I used to think, okay, let me be vulnerable here.
You're on our couch.
No, I know. But I do try to avoid, I try to avoid talking about this in a way that unnecessarily causes angst amongst people,
Friction,
right?
yeah. We've got enough of that.
Well, and we're trying to do work in cities. That's complex. Mm-hmm. That means a lot of people need to be involved. I think Jane Jacobs was right when she said cities are co-creations. If you're not co-creating with people who are unlike you, you're not doing it right. Mm-hmm. And so, when I say, for example, I was a registered Republican in the early 2000s, and I come from a small town, and I have a rather conservative disposition, a lot of people just stop listening then. And so I tend to not start with that or bring that up, or that's not part of my conversation.
It's distracting.
Right, it's distracting. But it's true. I mean, that's where, I remember there's an early article, 2010 or 2011, a Minnesota article, where someone found me and thought I was kind of novel, and in this publication called MinPost, wrote a clickbaity headline, "Why one Minnesota Republican thinks the suburbs are a Ponzi scheme." And the thing is it's such a great clickbait headline that if you type my name into Google, it's still to this day, like 14 years later, one of the top 5 things that come up. I have become less political in terms of, I think by the time we got to 2008, I was pretty much voting we've had a healthy independent party in Minnesota for a long time. Mm-hmm. We elected Jesse Ventura, mm-hmm. who was an independent governor. Mm-hmm. And then after him, there was a series of very competent people who ran. They didn't win, but they ran as independents. Mm-hmm. And I got involved in some of their campaigns. I thought for a long time that I was an independent. And it took me a while, and I would say maybe 20, around the board coming on, 2014, 2015, that I started to think about it in terms of where the power is centered. In other words, I don't think that the tension we have in this country is as much left and right. That's how we talk about it, because that's kind of how it's fed to us. But I think the tension is more, where's the power? Who makes the decisions? Is it a top-down centralization of power, or is it a bottom-up kind of diffusion of power? And I very, very strongly fall in the bottom-up category. And the amazing thing is when you start talking about power dynamics vertically like that, there is a lot of alignment that I find with very, very progressive people and very, very conservative people who both want more bottom-up power, things to be more bottom-up. There's tension there, but the tension tends to be with the people who define things in a very top-down way. And so I have found that I can go in front of a really, really progressive audience, share our stuff, and they'll be like, yeah, I see myself in that. And I can go in front of a really, really conservative audience and do the same thing. And they'll be like, yeah, I'm completely buying into it. People used to, Will Dowdy. Will was one of our next gen people back in the day. I gave a talk in Redding, California in 2013. And it was a very polarized community. I was in an auditorium, and half the auditorium were there with the smart growth for whatever county, and they were loud and obnoxious. And then there was another group there that was the Tea Party movement, whatever that had morphed into in 2013, they were the Northern California Tea Party movement, the Patriots, whatever, right? Will was sitting in the middle, and after I got done, Will said this thing to me that really, it meant so much. He goes, I sat in the middle, and the people over here were cheering for you.
Mm-hmm. The smart growth people.
Oh yeah, pointing at them, thought you were making fun of them the whole time.
Oh my God.
And the people over here were cheering for you, pointing at them, thinking that you were making fun of them the whole time. And he goes, I don't know how you did that, but it's magical. And for a long time, I didn't know how I did it either until I got this framework. And it was really a guy named Blake Pagankoff that explained it to me, that what I was doing was talking about things from a bottom-up standpoint, and that created this more universal framework. And my enemy, if we want to say that, is the kind of top-down.
Yeah.
And that is not to say, so when we say it's political or it's not political in the left-right paradigm we define it. But to me, like if you listen to any of our modern politics, 99% of it, there's a consensus that power should be wielded from the top down. And so I kind of come across as an independent or separate from that. But what I actually am is a very like bottom-up person.
Well, and how much do you think of it? We've been talking this banter around crisis response.
Yeah.
And how much of what you're describing would you say is attributable to, you've identified this crisis, that the North American development pattern needs to change, and the traditional top-down approach to that is that we need a very big, rapid, singular response to a very complicated, diffuse problem.
Climate change.
Yeah.
Public health,
Housing.
housing.
And so
go through it. Right?
And when we do that, we build too much of the same thing at the same time in the same place, and it's really oppressive to the diversity of the bottom up.
The response creates.
But your response. So I think one of the needles you've threaded in the movement you created is you've identified this quiet crisis that in various ways we all kind of wrestle with. But your response isn't this like overly massive crisis mode response that we're so accustomed to now. It's, no, we're going to solve this from the bottom up. It's going to be a lot of small things that you and I, who may disagree on some things, but you and I both have agency to go affect tomorrow. And that is a very approachable message, regardless of where your starting point is. Is that at all linked?
No, it is. But I think, to me, it's probably more linked to my diagnosis of the problem than it is like the optimal solution. So we're having this cathartic moment about redlining. And redlining is categorically evil. And we look at it today as racist, and it was racist people who did it, and they were awful. I get that, like I'm sympathetic to that, like I understand that, and I understand why we look at that today. If you go back and read stuff at the time, you can cherry pick out the most racist, horrible, offensive things. But if you go back with a more generous like framework of understanding, you actually can see some kind of like mainstream logic in it. The federal government was starting to intervene in the housing market in a way they had never done before. They were putting taxpayer money at risk, basically backing mortgages and backing loans and backing local banks. And the prudent people in the government who were like, we're not gonna gamble with taxpayer money, said we're only gonna back homes in quote unquote like high quality, good neighborhoods. I think that you could have that view and not be racist. I think in the modern understanding of racism, you probably couldn't have that view and not have a racist outcome, right? So when we look at what happened there and then reflect it through time, I think we have to recognize is that the problem is less, the racism was there, yes, but the problem was actually you paired it with this top-down device that really had none of the local nuance. So it became this like overwhelming thing that reflected through the years. You can see this with interstates. You can see this with, essentially the incentives to do zoning. You see this in the mortgage market. All of these things were done and had a plausible narrative of generosity and helpfulness in solving a problem. But what they lacked is they lacked a framework to actually adapt to the human condition, to change, to evolve. And for me, when you recognize that, when you can break out of the narrative that the people who did that were bad and I am good, therefore I can use the One Ring for good as opposed to evil like they did. If you recognize that like they were fallible humans and I'm a fallible human, and maybe fallible humans is just kind of how we are, maybe we shouldn't have this tool in this way. Yeah. You start to say like, maybe we should just throw the One Ring into the volcano and let it go, and then we can start building this thing in a better way.
Yeah, that acknowledges who we are.
Yeah, that acknowledges who we are. And you know what? We are racist people. We are cruel people. We are mean people. We're also beautiful people and friendly people and kind and compassionate people. And I think when we create these huge top-down systems, it doesn't reflect often, even if it initially reflects the better part of our nature, as time goes on and the institutions become less responsive and less flexible and more ingrained, it doesn't reflect the better nature of our character. Right. And I do think that my embrace of a bottom-up approach is really more about my diagnosis of the problem than like having a fetish with like a populist bottom-up approach, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a better fit.
Yeah,
Yeah, because are highways bad? No, highways are not bad, right? But like finishing the interstate highway system in like 1968, and then continuing the program for another 50 years, just out of inertia, like what are we doing? And I think that is kind of emblematic of how top-down systems work. That's a very conservative critique of government, of top-down systems, but I think it's one that progressives can be, sympathetic to, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so before starting Yard with Joe, I was pretty hyper-local in my work here in Cincinnati, and having traveled for the last 6 years to everywhere from Palm Beach, Florida to, North St. Louis to small town America, I think what you're saying is very reflective of what I've seen, which is it's given me more faith in humanity and totally changed how I think about politics, because when you're actually doing the work from the bottom up in these places, regardless of the income, the race, the size of the town, politics is not, the right-left conversation is not anywhere to be seen. They're getting to work at building up their town, whether it's
or when you do see it, you recognize it very quickly as an artificial dysfunction added to the conversation, right?
That's not helpful.
When you show up at the meeting and someone's talking about abortion politics or whatever, you're like, or Gaza is the one that, every council's got to have a resolution on Gaza now. And I'm like, I think we could talk about that all day in a very compassionate way and have many different points of view. I don't know as we need to do that to fix the street out there, right?
Yeah, I was having a conversation actually with my mom recently, and she was like, "Why aren't you so upset about the border?" And my response to that was, "Well, I don't see it. I don't see it from my front porch.
We can't paint crosswalks."
Right. Yeah. Well, and so part of that podcast that I did, there's this tension because I don't want people to think that like Gaza doesn't matter and the border doesn't matter and abortion doesn't matter and gun rights doesn't matter or whatever like your issue is doesn't matter. But the reality is that if I spend 5% of my time worried about that and 95% of my time worried about things I can actually affect, I can change the world. If I spend 95% of my time worried about something that I really can't impact in any way, decades of my life will go by and I will have wasted it.
Yeah.
Right, and I agree. The border, Gaza, these are important issues. It sounds selfish to say, well, it's not affecting my life.
Right.
So why should I be getting so upset about it? That sounds selfish, but it's in a way a good selfishness because I care about what's in front of me. Instead of protesting for Gaza, do you go to your local school board meeting?
Well,
do you go to planning commission? Do you
yes.
paint crosswalks? Do you participate in some way? And I think we're losing that.
Adam Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was a book that was kind of paired with The Wealth of Nations. And I have not read either. I've read snippets of them. I've read analysis of them. If you've got, these are not readable by normal people, right? Yes. But one of the insights that come from the theory of moral sentiments is he has a insight where he says, if you tell me that an earthquake happened in China and 10 million people died, I may be sad, and that may affect me, but I will go to bed tonight and sleep soundly. If you tell me that tomorrow morning someone is going to chop off my pinky, I will be up all night and not be able to sleep. Which one is bigger tragedy? But which one affects you more? And that is an insight on human nature that we may not be comfortable with. But in telling this story, what he is trying to describe is the idea that with every human interaction, there actually is a certain amount of capital, human capital, that we trade back and forth. The closer you are to yourself, the closer like you and me are as humans, the more real you are and the less abstract you are. I think when we ask humans to live in abstraction, they actually become quite neurotic and unhelpful. And to the point about Gaza, what a horrible human tragedy. I still sleep at night because it is abstract for me. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make it not real, and that doesn't make it something not to care about, but it does make it something that has less impact to me than if I knew you were hurting, right? Because you are someone I know and I have an interaction with. In the realm of the universe, is that correct? Probably not. Like maybe I should be more worried about the millions of people affected across the world, but I am also human. Yeah. And I think if we don't acknowledge our humanity in that way, I think we will not do things that are helpful. That's great. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. We should probably wrap it up soon.
That's a great way to...
Yeah, do you want to end on...
Well, I was hearing you talk, and I'm thinking back through all the conversations we've had, and I would say you're a unique guest in a number of ways. One of the ways you're unique is you're the only guest we've had that know my parents.
Oh, sure.
And they're 2 of our 8 followers.
As you say, my mom might be upset about the border it comes.
So there's a connection there with our audience that you have.
Yeah.
In here.
Well,
really
you start small. I mean, let me say, my mom was the early adopter of Strong Towns too. So it's a good feedback, right? If nothing else, it's encouragement.
It is.
She's like, Chucky, keep going.
Well, thank you for coming. Thanks for all that you do. And this was a fun week. It was really interesting and fun to be the host city.
Totally easier to go to somebody else's city, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was more exhausting, I think, having it here.
Let me say 2 things before we're done then. First of all, you have a beautiful city. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think people, Cincinnati, all right, it's Ohio, I think, has low cachet nationwide, right? And
by definition, it's considered average.
By definition, it's considered. This is not an average city. This is a very above average place. This is a great place.
And if punches above its weight, for sure.
It punches way above its weight. And if people haven't been to Cincinnati, they need to come here, experience the neighborhoods. This is a beautiful city. It really is. Second of all, I know I said this at the top. I think it's worth saying at the end. You guys do fantastic work.
Appreciate that.
I can't tell you how many invitations I got this week. Will you come and do this? Will you come and do that? This one was at the top of my list, and I said yes right away, and we crowded everything else out because I think it's important for us. We're friends, yes, but I also want to celebrate your work and the leadership you have and the stuff you're doing. And I didn't know you had an office now in Oklahoma City, which is super cool. Like, I'm happy to see that happening. We got to get you a Brainerd office soon.
Yeah. But we have someone in Chicago that's close. We're trying to get her to move to Cincinnati, but so we're making inroads.
Well, it's cool to see the success that you've had and the good work that you've done. I've watched it from afar, and it's fun being here, experiencing it live. So congratulations to you.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Chuck.
Well, let's get on your plane.
Yeah. I'm heading to the airport, going home.
Cool.
All right.